Helen stood in my living room, pointing to my customized bay window, and told her friends she planned to knock it down to expand her master bedroom. I didn't cry. I took action. 72 hours later, her entire life was packed into black trash bags on the front lawn, and she never saw the locksmith coming. Let me tell you how a temporary 3-month favor turns into a 4-year hostage situation. I bought my house in San Diego when I was 27. 4 bedrooms, a sprawling backyard, and a mortgage that had my name and only my name on the deed. I worked 80-hour weeks at a corporate consulting firm to afford the down payment. It was my sanctuary, the physical manifestation of my independence. Every piece of furniture, every paint color, every fixture was chosen by me, paid for by me. It was the one place in the world where I made the rules. 2 years later, I married Mark. Mark was gentle, conflict avoidant, and deeply, helplessly entangled in the emotional web of his parents, Helen and Arthur. It started 4 years ago with a panicked phone call. Black mold, Helen had gasped over the line, her voice trembling with that practiced fragility only a seasoned manipulator can perfect. The contractor says our condo is completely unlivable. It's just for a few months, Clara. Just until the remediation is done. We have nowhere else to go. I said yes. That was my first catastrophic mistake. Empathy is a beautiful human trait, but it becomes a fatal flaw when you hand it to someone who views it merely as a vulnerability to be exploited. They moved into the first-floor guest suite on a rainy Tuesday in October. By Friday, Helen had completely rearranged my kitchen cabinets because my organization system didn't make logical sense to anyone who actually cooks. By month 2, Arthur had taken over my 2-car garage, throwing out my expensive gardening supplies to make room for his sprawling woodworking tools. And by month 3, the supposed, agreed-upon move-out date, the narrative had smoothly, effortlessly shifted. The mold was worse than expected. The contractor ran away with their deposit money. The insurance company was stalling. It was always an excuse. Always a tragedy. Always a reason they had to stay just a little bit longer. Years passed. 4 agonizing years. Let the weight of that time sink in. I was effectively reduced to an unpaid staff member in my own home. Helen didn't just cross boundaries. She bulldozed them, paved a driveway over the rubble, and charged me a toll to walk on it. She dictated the thermostat settings, keeping the house at a sweltering 78 degrees. She dictated what we watched on television in the evenings. She hosted her bridge club every single Thursday, introducing me to her friends not as her daughter-in-law, not as the owner of the house, but as Mark's lovely little wife who helped PS out around the place. Then there was David, Mark's older brother, the golden child. David could do no wrong. He was a freelance entrepreneur, which was a polite way of saying he was a 36-year-old man who lived entirely off credit cards and empty promises. He would walk into my house without knocking, open my refrigerator, drink directly from the orange juice carton, and leave his muddy shoes on my custom cream-colored rugs. Helen started inviting David over for dinner 5 nights a week. I was cooking 4-course meals for a family that treated me like the hired help. When I politely asked David to chip in for groceries after my weekly bill hit $300, Helen dramatically burst into tears at the dining table, accusing me of trying to starve her struggling boy while I sat on a mountain of corporate money. I begged Mark to intervene. I told him we needed our space back. I told him my mental health was rapidly deteriorating under the weight of his mother's constant, suffocating presence. His answer was always the exact same rehearsed line. Just ignore it, Clara. You know how she is. She's getting older. It's easier to just keep the peace. Keeping the peace. Let's talk about that phrase for a moment. If you are listening to this and something in your chest feels tight and dangerously familiar, I need you to hear me clearly right now. Keeping the peace is a beautifully polite name for slow, deliberate self-destruction. When you are dealing with a narcissistic family system, keeping the peace actually means carrying their war inside your own body, so they don't have to. You bite your tongue, you swallow your anger, and you violently shrink yourself to fit into the tiny, suffocating box they built for your existence. But the peace is a lie. There is no peace. There is only their absolute comfort, purchased entirely with your sanity. You think you are being patient and noble, but what you are really doing is teaching them that your boundaries are fully negotiable. You are showing them that if they push hard enough, if they complain loud enough, you will eventually collapse and give them exactly what they want. The peace they demand is nothing more than your quiet, absolute surrender. Stop setting yourself on fire just to keep them warm. I spent 4 years setting myself on fire. I paid the utility bills that had tripled since they arrived. I bought the ridiculously expensive organic groceries Helen demanded because her delicate digestion simply couldn't handle regular produce. I watched Mark, my husband, the man I loved, shrink into a terrified, compliant little boy every single time his mother raised her voice or offered a disapproving sigh. We stopped having dates. We stopped having intimate conversations. Our entire marriage became nothing more than a life support system for Helen's emotional needs and Arthur's complete lack of boundaries. I swallowed my pride, my comfort, and my voice. But the breaking point wasn't the groceries. It wasn't the skyrocketing electricity bill. It wasn't even the bridge club treating me like a maid. It was the mail. What I found inside a heavy, misdelivered manila envelope that Tuesday morning changed absolutely everything I thought I knew about the past 4 years. And it locked a door they would never ever reopen. For 4 years, I operated under the assumption that I was dealing with difficult family members. That morning, with that envelope in my hands, I realized I was dealing with financial predators. The mail was a thick, heavy manila envelope, slightly water damaged at the bottom corner because the new postman had lazily jammed it halfway into the box. It was addressed to Arthur. The return address belonged to a boutique CPA firm in downtown San Diego. Arthur wasn't home. He was at the hardware store buying more expensive tools with Mark's credit card. The flap of the envelope was barely sealed. I didn't even hesitate. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the thick stack of papers. It was a finalized tax return. Schedule E. Supplemental income and loss. My eyes scanned down the page. There, listed in stark black ink, was their unlivable, mold-infested condo. Under gross rents received, the number hit me like a physical blow to the chest. $33,600 for the year. $2,800 a month. They had been renting it out. For 4 years. My blood ran cold. I flipped to the next page. Bank statements were attached as proof of income for a new line of credit. Over $134,000 sitting comfortably in a high-yield savings account. While I paid for Helen's organic groceries. While I covered the spiked electricity bills. While they ate my food, dominated my space, and treated me like absolute garbage. They were running a highly profitable scam, and I was their silent, subsidizing sponsor. But that wasn't the worst part. Oh no, the financial deception was merely the appetizer. At the bottom of the envelope was a separate folder, labeled Residency CA. Inside was a printed email thread between Arthur and a cut-rate real estate attorney. Arthur had been asking specific, calculated questions about California tenancy laws. He wanted to know exactly how long someone had to live in a property without a formal lease to establish permanent tenant rights. He asked if modifying a property like taking over a garage for a workshop could be used to claim a percentage of equity from the homeowner. He was meticulously researching how to force a legal partition sale. He wasn't just planning to stay forever. He was planning to legally anchor himself to the deed of my house. He was looking for a way to make it impossible for me to ever sell my own home without paying them a massive, 6-figure payout. The room went dead silent. The ringing in my ears faded into a sharp, crystalline focus. All the anxiety, the suffocating guilt, the endless desire to keep the peace evaporated instantly. It was replaced by something entirely new. Cold, hard, terrifying calculation. I didn't confront them. Not yet. A confrontation right then would have been an emotional release, and I didn't need emotional release. I needed total, structural annihilation. I carefully photographed every single page using a scanner app on my phone. The app kept buffering and crashed twice because the Wi-Fi connection in the hallway was terrible, a minor frustration. But I stood there, taking steady breaths until I had perfectal, legible copies of everything. Then I slid the papers back into the envelope, smoothed down the torn flap with a glue stick, and placed it exactly where I found it on the entryway table. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Not a soft family lawyer. I called a vicious, high-end real estate litigator whose entire career was built on dismantling squatters and hostile tenants in the state of California. I sat in his sleek, glass-walled office, handed him the printed photos, and watched him read. I let out a short, humorless laugh as his eyebrows slowly raised. They're trying to establish adverse possession through the back door, combined with a tenant at will claim, he told me, tapping his heavy pen. In California, if you let them stay past 30 days, they are legally your tenants. Even without a lease. Even without paying rent. If you just lock them out, they can sue you for illegal eviction, and they will absolutely win. You need a paper trail, and you need it yesterday. Let's talk about a paper trail. If you are ever forced to deal with manipulative people, your memory means nothing. Your feelings mean absolutely nothing. A paper trail is the only truth the law recognizes. A document signed before the conflict is basic self-preservation. When someone is financially abusing you, they rely entirely on the fact that you will be too polite, too trusting, or too exhausted to document their actions in real time. Start writing things down. Keep receipts. Save text messages. The moment you realize you are being played, you stop communicating with your voice and you start communicating with ink. Financial abuse is still abuse and it always leaves evidence. So how do I get them out? I asked my lawyer, keeping my voice steady. We serve them a formal notice to quit, he replied. But because they've been there over a year, California law requires a 60-day notice. Unless he paused, leaning forward. Unless they commit a lease violation or create a documented nuisance. Have they damaged the property? Arthur knocked down a load-bearing shelf in the garage without permits to fit his table saw, I said smoothly. And Helen has been paying a sketchy, unlicensed contractor in cash to draft architectural plans to demolish my custom bay window. That's unauthorized structural modification, the lawyer confirmed, writing furiously on his notepad. That drops the notice period from 60 days to 3 days. But you need to prove it. You need photos, invoices, and absolute proof they initiated it. 3 days. I liked the sound of 3 days. I spent the next 2 weeks operating like a ghost in my own home. I was pleasant. I was completely compliant. I cooked Helen's ridiculous meals. I let David walk in and drink my orange juice. But every time I smiled, I was quietly compiling a dossier of their destruction. I took time-stamped photos of the damaged garage walls. I found the unauthorized architectural plans Helen hid under her mattress and scanned those too. I ordered a hidden Wi-Fi camera to install in the garage to catch Arthur doing unpermitted electrical work. I thought I was moving flawlessly. I thought I had everything perfectly contained. What I didn't anticipate was that Mark, my passive, conflict-avoidant husband, would come home early on a Thursday afternoon and find the camera box sitting on my desk before the T-wrap was fully set. What I've told you so far is how I gathered my ammunition. What comes next is exactly how I fired it. Mark stood in the home office holding the small cardboard box, his face pale and confused. He asked me why I was buying surveillance equipment. I didn't sugarcoat it. I sat him down and handed him the printed photos of his parents' tax returns, the bank statements, and the emails about adverse possession. I watched my husband's entire reality shatter in real time. He read the numbers. He saw the betrayal. He didn't scream. He just put his head in his hands and wept quietly. I told him he had a choice. He could stand with his wife, or he could pack his bags and leave with his parents. He chose me. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday. Helen had invited David over for dinner again, and she was holding court at the head of my dining table. She took a sip of her wine, wrinkled her nose, and looked right at me. Clara, this roast is incredibly dry, and quite frankly, I'm exhausted from living in this cramped space, she announced, her voice dripping with that familiar, theatrical martyrdom. Arthur has scheduled the contractor to come tomorrow morning to finally knock out that ugly bay window and expand our suite. It's for the best, really. I didn't flinch. I reached under the table, my hands trembling so violently that I had to dig my nails into my own thigh to stop shaking. Nobody is knocking down anything, I said, looking her dead in the eye. I pulled a thick, black plastic folder from my lap and dropped it heavily onto the center of the table right next to the gravy boat. It landed with a sharp smack. Inside were the printed bank statements, the Schedule E tax return showing $33,000 in rental income, the emails to the real estate attorney, and the formal, legally binding 3-day notice to quit for unauthorized structural modifications. Helen snatched the folder, ready to berate me for being dramatic. She opened it. I watched her eyes track over the bold black numbers. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking sallow and suddenly very old. She started shaking her head aggressively, her mouth opening and closing without sound before she finally found her voice. "This is a fabrication. You are engaging in a vicious smear campaign against your own family," she shrieked, her hands gripping the table edges so hard her knuckles turned white. "We are penniless. We are victims, and you are just a greedy, ungrateful little girl trying to throw sick elders onto the street." David dropped his fork, his eyes darting frantically between the tax returns and his mother's panicked face, realizing his endless cash supply was built on a lie. Mark stood up from his chair, refusing to look at his parents. "You have 72 hours to vacate my property," I said. "Let's talk about boundaries for a second. The moment you finally stand up for yourself, the narcissist will immediately accuse you of being cruel. But boundaries are simply a description of what you will and will not accept in your own life. Enforcing those boundaries is never an act of cruelty. It is an act of absolute clarity. You cannot reason with someone who actively benefits from misunderstanding you. Their anger is not a sign that you did something wrong, it is the proof that your boundary is working." When Helen realized the screaming wasn't working, she immediately pivoted to the gaslighting. She burst into hysterics, clutching her chest and crying out for Arthur to do something. Arthur, who had been suspiciously quiet, puffed out his chest and tried to physically intimidate me, taking a heavy step toward my chair. That was when Mark finally found his spine. He stepped directly between me and his father. It was the first time in his entire life he had ever defied his parents. "You lied to me," Mark said, his voice cracking but holding firm. "You looked me in the eye. You cried about being broke, and you had over $100,000 sitting in a bank account while Clara worked 80-hour weeks. Get out. Get out of our house." Helen threw herself onto the floor. Literally. A grown woman rolling on the hardwood, wailing that she was having a heart attack. I didn't even blink. I pulled out my phone and calmly offered to dial 911 for an ambulance. Miraculously, her cardiac episode cured itself the second she realized paramedics would mean a hospital bill. The packing process was a nightmare. Helen tried to pack my expensive crystal glasses, claiming I had gifted them to her for Christmas 2 years ago. I stood by the door and physically took the box out of her hands, placing it back in my cabinet. She called every extended family member who would pick up the phone, spinning wild, delusional stories about how I had suddenly lost my mind and thrown them out into the cold because I was deeply mentally unstable. Her smear campaign was aggressive, but it was remarkably sloppy. She forgot that several of Mark's cousins were real estate professionals who immediately understood exactly what adverse possession meant when I mass texted them the screenshots of Arthur's emails. The family group chat went dead silent. Nobody offered them a couch to crash on. The locksmith arrived on Wednesday morning, while they were still frantically shoving their belongings into black trash bags on the front lawn. I stood on the porch drinking my coffee, watching a professional swap out every single lock, bolt, and window latch on the first floor. Arthur pointed a finger at me and threatened to sue me for illegal eviction. I simply smiled, tapped the thick black folder sitting on the railing, and reminded him that if he wanted to go to a judge, I would be more than happy to present his blatant tax FR. Odd, and his little emails about stealing my equity to the IRS. That shut him up instantly. The threat of federal tax evasion charges is a remarkable silencer. By Thursday evening, the guest suite was completely empty. The silence in the house was deafening. It felt like I could finally breathe for the first time in 4 years. I walked through the rooms, turning off the oppressive heat, reclaiming my space, and erasing every trace of their existence. But a narcissist never truly leaves without a parting gift. I thought the war was over because they had physically vacated the premises. What I didn't know was that David, the golden child, had made one final, desperate move before they drove away. I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong because a cornered narcissist, stripped of their narrative control, is the most dangerous version of themselves. David, the 36-year-old golden child who contributed absolutely nothing to society, decided to exact revenge on his parents' behalf. While Helen and Arthur were furiously stuffing trash bags on my lawn, David slipped into the kitchen and swiped the spare key fob to Mark's SUV. He drove it straight to a high-interest title loan office on the edge of town. His plan was brilliantly stupid. He intended to forge Mark's signature, take out a massive, predatory loan against the vehicle, pocket the cash, and leave us with a devastating financial lien as a parting gift. He genuinely believed that because Mark drove the car every day, it was legally Mark's property. But David had made the same fatal error his parents did. He underestimated me. The SUV wasn't in Mark's name. I bought it before we were married. My name was the only one on the title. And more importantly, because it was a newer model, it was equipped with an active, real-time GPS tracking system synced directly to an app on my phone. I didn't call Mark to tell him his brother was a thief. I didn't call Helen to negotiate a return. I simply sat at my kitchen island, opened the app, watched the little blue dot park at the title loan office, and dialed the San Diego Police Department. I kept my voice steady as I reported the vehicle stolen. When the dispatcher asked if I knew who took it, I gave them David's full name, his physical description, and his exact GPS coordinates. I informed them he was currently attempting to commit wire fraud using a stolen vehicle title. Police arrived exactly 14 minutes later. According to the report I obtained later, David was sitting in the lobby, mid-forgery, when two officers walked in. He didn't get to deliver a dramatic speech. He didn't get to manipulate his way out of it. He was thrown against the hood of a cruiser, handcuffed, and arrested for grand theft auto and attempted fraud. He spent his first night in the county jail crying so loudly that the holding cell guards documented it. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Helen called Mark at 3 in the morning, screaming so hysterically I could hear her through the phone speaker from across the bedroom. She demanded Mark go down to the precinct and drop the charges. She ordered him to tell the police it was just a silly family misunderstanding. Mark sat up in bed, looked at me, and then spoke the most beautiful sentence I had heard in 4 years. "Mom, he stole Clara's car and tried to commit felony fraud. I'm not dropping anything. Do not call this number again." And he hung up. He blocked her number. He blocked Arthur's number. To bail David out and hire a criminal defense attorney capable of keeping him out of state prison, Helen and Arthur were forced to immediately liquidate a massive chunk of their high-D-den savings. The $134,000 they had hoarded while living rent-free in my home. It evaporated. They drained their accounts to save the golden child from his own catastrophic entitlement. But I wasn't finished. When you are dealing with financial predators, you don't just kick them out of your house. You burn the ships so they can never sail back to your shores. I had promised Arthur, while standing on the porch, that if he left quietly, I wouldn't take his tax fraud to a judge. But I never signed a contract, and I certainly never promised I wouldn't mail a completely anonymous, heavily documented package to the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower office. I printed out the pristine photos of their Schedule E tax returns, the bank statements proving the hidden rental income, and the emails detailing their adverse possession plot. I placed them in a crisp envelope, dropped it in a blue mailbox, and I let out a short, humorless laugh as it slid down the chute. The IRS does not care about your family drama. The IRS does not care that you are a delicate older woman with a bridge club. When they smell undeclared rental income and tax evasion, they move with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a meat grinder. 3 weeks later, through the family grapevine, we heard that Helen and Arthur's remaining bank accounts had been abruptly frozen pending a massive federal audit. They were forced to move out of their luxury hotel and into a cramped, depressing one-bedroom apartment on the bad side of town. Their entire world had collapsed. Their carefully constructed image was in ruins. The extended family, having seen the undeniable proof of their greed, completely alienated them. They were broke, their favorite son was facing a felony trial, and they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. But the narcissistic ego cannot accept defeat. It cannot process accountability. Even with her bank accounts frozen and her son in legal peril, Helen could not resist making one final, utterly insane attempt to reclaim her power over me. I was walking out of my corporate office building on a rainy Tuesday evening, wrapping my coat around myself, when I saw her. She was standing next to my car in the parking garage. She looked haggard, her hair unkempt, the expensive clothes she bought with my money now hanging loosely on her frame. But her eyes were burning with a terrifying, unhinged malice. She didn't have her husband. She didn't have her golden child. She just had a thick manila folder of her own, and she was walking straight toward me with a smile that made my blood run cold. "You thought you won," Helen spat, her voice echoing in the damp parking garage. She slapped the folder against my driver's window, leaving a greasy smudge. "You think you can throw family on the street and walk away rich? Meet my contractor. He filed a mechanic's lien on your property for $85,000. Unpaid labor for the modifications we authorized. If you don't pay in 30 days, they foreclose on your precious house. We'll own it." She was practically vibrating with malicious joy. She had spent her last emotional energy coordinating with her unlicensed contractor to forge invoices for the unfinished demolition. She thought she had found the ultimate legal loophole to extort me. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I let out a short, humorless laugh. It wasn't an intimidating act. I genuinely found her absolute delusion hilarious. "Helen," I said slowly, speaking to her with the precise cadence one might use to address a very slow, confused toddler. "Did you actually research California property law, or did you just watch a 5-minute TikTok video?" Her smug smile faltered slightly, her eyes darting nervously. "In California," I explained, my voice echoing coldly, "an unlicensed contractor has no legal standing to file a valid mechanic's lien. Furthermore, filing a fraudulent lien to extort a legal owner is a severe felony under Penal Code Section 115, offering a false instrument for recording. It carries up to 3 years in state prison." I casually unlocked my phone screen. "But please, give me his full name. I would love to add felony extortion to the thick dossier I am providing to the district attorney's office." The color vanished from her face. She hadn't just failed to intimidate me. She had actively documented her criminal conspiracy and hand-delivered the evidence. She snatched the folder off my glass, hands shaking so violently she dropped several papers, and practically sprinted toward the stairwell. I didn't chase her. I just got into my car, locked the doors, wiped the smudge off my window, and drove home to my peaceful, quiet house. That was the absolute last time I ever saw my mother-in-law in person. Let's talk about guilt versus shame. When you finally cut off a toxic family member, the first thing you feel isn't relief, it's a crushing wave of guilt. If you are listening to this and your chest feels tight, understand the difference. Guilt is the feeling that you did something wrong. Shame is the toxic belief that you are something wrong. Narcissistic family systems implant shame so you will constantly betray your boundaries to prove you are a good person. They weaponize your empathy. You are not responsible for managing their emotional dysregulation. The exit strategy is brutal. You have to stop trying to prove your goodness to people committed to misunderstanding you. Drop the rope. Let them be the victim in their fabricated story. The following months were a masterclass in boundary enforcement. The federal audit dismantled Arthur and Helen's fraudulent financial empire. The IRS aggressively garnished their Social Security checks, seized their assets, and levied crushing fines for the undeclared rental income. They ended up having to sell their precious condo, the exact same one supposedly unlivable with black mold, at a massive loss to cover their federal back taxes. They are currently renting a tiny, rundown apartment in a neighborhood they used to openly mock. David's criminal case moved through the justice system with brutal, unforgiving efficiency. Because he was caught mid-forgery with the stolen, GPS-tracked vehicle right outside the window, his exhausted public defender practically begged him to take a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of attempted fraud. He received 3 years of formal probation, heavy financial restitution fines, and a permanent felony record that instantly ended his illustrious career as a freelance entrepreneur. He is currently working the night shift at a fast food drive-thru just to pay off his court-mandated fees. And Mark fundamentally changed. The shock of seeing his parents' true faces, the unapologetic theft, the pathological lies, the sheer entitlement finally broke the psychological spell he had been under since childhood. We started attending intensive couples therapy twice a week. He had to unlearn 30 years of toxic conditioning. He had to learn how to identify his own emotions instead of just desperately managing his mother's volatile moods. It wasn't a perfect, cinematic transition. There were incredibly difficult nights. There were moments he broke down, completely overwhelmed by the crushing realization that his parents never actually loved him as an independent son, but merely valued him as an obedient, useful tool to fund their lifestyle. He had to grieve the parents he never truly had. He had to learn how to set boundaries without feeling like he was committing a crime. But he did the hard, exhausting work of rebuilding his own psyche. He chose his marriage. He chose me. But more importantly, for the first time in his life, he finally chose himself. We established a strict, absolutely non-negotiable rule: zero communication with his toxic family system. When Helen tried to send a syrupy, guilt-tripping birthday card to our house 6 months later, complete with a long, rambling, 10-page letter about how family is forever, blood is thicker than water, and forgiveness is a virtue, Mark didn't even open the envelope. He didn't read a single manipulative word. He didn't call her to argue. He simply wrote "return to sender" in thick black Sharpie across the front and dropped it right back into the mailbox. It was a small, quiet gesture, but watching him do it felt like a massive, monumental victory for our marriage. There was still one final piece of business I had to handle to ensure my home was truly secure, because the quiet that follows a war can sometimes be the most dangerous time of all. I met with my high-end real estate litigator one final time. The eviction was complete, the locks were changed, and the federal tax audit was actively dismantling their lives. But I needed absolute, permanent certainty. I needed to ensure that no matter what happened in the future, even if tragedy struck and something happened to me, Helen and Arthur could never legally cross my threshold again. I walked back into my house that afternoon and stood in the living room, looking at the custom bay window Helen had been so desperate to demolish. The afternoon sun was pouring through the glass, casting a warm, golden light across my cream-colored rugs. There were no muddy footprints from David. There was no unsolicited, sharp commentary about my cooking. There was no suffocating heat from a thermostat I wasn't allowed to touch. There was only pure, unadulterated silence. For the first time in 4 agonizing years, my home felt like mine again. I placed my house, the title to my car, and every single one of my financial assets into an ironclad, irrevocable living trust. I established incredibly specific, legally binding stipulations. I ensured that Mark would always be financially protected, but I explicitly named Helen, Arthur, and David as completely disinherited parties. I added a predatory clause stating that if any of them ever attempted to contest the trust, challenge my estate, or lay claim to the property, they would be immediately countersued. D for legal fees. I didn't just lock the front door. I locked the legal framework of my entire existence. My sanctuary was finally a fortress. People who scream the loudest about family loyalty have almost always done the absolute least to actually earn it. Loyalty, in a toxic family system, is simply a demand for your silent submission. They don't want your love. They want your compliance. They want your resources. Leaving quietly, legally, and permanently is the most powerful thing you can possibly do. You do not owe an explanation to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You do not owe your sanity to people who refuse to manage their own lives. Looking back on those 4 years of silent, suffocating endurance, what do I know now that I absolutely didn't know before this happened? I know that true peace is never purchased through appeasement. For years, I thought I was being the bigger person by swallowing my anger, cooking their meals, and shrinking my own life to accommodate their bottomless entitlement. I thought my patience would eventually be rewarded with basic respect. I was completely wrong. Narcissists view your patience as permission. They view your empathy as an open invitation to consume you. I learned that my house wasn't just a building. It was the physical boundary of my self-respect. I learned that you cannot negotiate with emotional terrorists, and you certainly cannot heal a sickness that refuses to acknowledge it exists. You can only save yourself, pack their bags, and change the damn locks. The cost of protecting my peace was high, but the cost of living in their war zone was my soul. I chose me, and I will never apologize for surviving. So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.